Ford GT, an American icon. I'm Maria Prekachis, and our show, well, it's all about this beautiful Ford GT. But let's talk about the early beginnings with my co-host, GT Joey.
Hello, Maria. Yes, that was the beginning. 1964, 1965 is where it all began. From Mark 1s to Mark 4s, eventually into the 2005, 2006 Ford GT.
What's your favorite?
Oh, well, I obviously like the new cars because they have air conditioning.
It's the little things that count.
That's right.
In these beautiful cars.
Two generations, race cars and street cars. We asked, what's your favorite?
The old ones, because they went to Europe and they raced against all the Ferraris and they won.
I like it because those are the ones that I remember from when I was young.
I'm really actually impressed by the one behind me here.
As a teenager growing up in the 60s, I fell in love with them because of the races that they won at Le Mans. And in my wildest dreams, I didn't think I was ever going to be able to get my hands on one. And when Ford decided to rebuild them, I did as much as I could to get my hands on one.
Here at the Ford Nationals at Carlisle events, it is all about the Ford GT. Now, the original Ford GTs were called the GT40s back in the mid-60s. And who better to talk about them than our own GT Joey.
Now this is exciting. I'm standing in front of an original Mark 1 GT40 and original Mark 2 GT40. Look at the inspiration that was obviously used for the new Ford GT. They're just beautiful, beautiful cars. When we look at the Mark 1, you could obviously see the inspiration that led into the 2005 2006 Ford GT. Originally started out and they had a lot of problems at the beginning. They couldn't get these cars up to speed. They couldn't keep these cars on the ground. Then came Carroll Shelby basically in 1965 and the Holman Moody Group with Mark IIs eventually down the road. These cars were then bumped up to 289s and then they started to take off and they started to win at Sebring, Le Mans, and everywhere else. 1966, Ford upped the ante and went to a big block 427 cubic inch engine. Then they started to dominate. These are the cars in 1966 at Le Mans, took first, second, and third place. These two cars were obviously the inspiration for Camillo Pardo and the entire Ford GT engineering department and design team to produce the 2005-2006 GT. They're just wonderful looking automobiles.
Now let's test your Ford GT IQ with this GT trivia question. Even though the GT40's main purpose was for winning races, what was mandatory on the Mark III street version to qualify for racing? A. Seatbelts. B. A trunk. C. A horn. The answer coming up on Ford GT, an American icon. Now here's the answer to our GT trivia. What was mandatory on street Ford GTs to qualify for racing? The answer is B, a trunk.
Welcome back to Ford GT, an American icon. I'm Maria Prekachis, and I found my buddy Tomcat here.
Tom Baronic.
Tom Baronic.
How you doing?
I'll let you say the last name. So you have a beautiful 2006.
Well, this 2006 is essentially a modern day version of what really occurred back in 1966. And that would be 40 years prior. So this is a replica of the original race car, the Mark II, and mine is kind of the next generation of that original race car. So the DNA is related, but nonetheless, they're quite different in size, safety, and performance.
Why this car?
Well, I guess I saw the original Steve McQueen movie Le Mans when I was a kid, and him racing down the Mulsanne Straits, racing Porsches and GT40s. I was a young kid. I wanted to make my bicycle go faster, and speed was everything, and I just thought that was the epitome of cool. So when I was old enough to be able to afford one, I'm living my childhood dream.
And I think both of these go faster than your bicycle. I'm just saying.
I'm thinking, I was pretty quick.
GT Joey is with an owner of an original Mark III.
Today, this is a very special day for us. You took out one of your prized possessions, a 1968 GT40 Mark III,
That's correct.
which there's only 7 in the world that were ever produced
They
for the
made
street.
7.
How long have you had the car, Gary?
I found this car at the National Motor Museum in Bewley in England in late 2010. A friend of mine took me there and said, there's something you need to see. It's off in the corner. I'm not sure people know what it is. And strangely, it was a nice original car, 5,000 miles on it, but somebody had put a really cheap paint job on it. The museum didn't own it. It had been there at Bewley for 30 years, but I found the lady that did own it. And her husband had put it there 30 years ago and had an unfortunate accident and died. It took me 2 years to convince her to sell it to me. We took it out of the museum, took it back to a place that works on some other race cars of mine in Battle, East Sussex, dismantled the car to the last bolt, even the wiper motor and the instruments in it, every little detail. But the white and blue paint had to go, so we started taking the paint off, and we found underneath a maroon color. So we used a spectrograph to measure the paint on it to come up with the exact color when we repainted this nice original car. The build sheet calls it amaranth, but when we did all the homework coming up with the paint, we found out it was just 67 Ford Fairlane Imperial Maroon.
Wow.
So it's just Ford paint.
Gary, what's wonderful about this car, you still kept the original Barani wheels on the car, which many people hopped them up and went to the GT40 race car wheels or the knockoff wheels, but these are just absolutely beautiful.
Well, and I know several of the Mark IIIs, people took the original Baranis off and put Mark I wheels on them, but that's not what they were. And this car was such a nice, unmolested original car. It still had the original Goodyear tires on it. The goal was to make it exactly the way it left Slough at Ford Advanced Vehicles in 1968.
Now, it took a little while to get all 7 cars built, so it was over a couple of years for the most part. Some of them were 289s, some of them were 302s.
Well, I looked that up in Ronnie Spain's book the other day because I was thinking only 2 302s, but actually 4 of the Mark IIIs had high-performance 302s in them, and the other 3 were 289s.
Probably earlier cars?
No, there was there was a mix. One of them was in the middle of the 302s, but this one, I think the horsepower rating on this was 306 horsepower. It's got a little 715 Holley carburetor on it. It's a wet sump engine. It's not a dry sump. Wow. But it's just a nice, easy running car.
It's a work of art, my friend.
Well, and you know, Joe, you look at them and you can see the profile on them is so similar, and you know where the 2005 Ford came from when you look at a GT40, but that's almost where it ends. On the modern GT, the fuel cell, the bladder is in the middle.
That's correct.
Of the console, but on the original GT40s, Mark 1s, 2s, and 3s, you can see the magnesium fuel fillers that go into, they're not bladders on this, but it's got aluminum fuel tanks that hold about 10 gallons in each rocker panel. Sills in England, but rocker panels for us here.
Now, is there a switch-over switch, or there's an electric pump that feeds?
No, it's got a Carter mechanical fuel pump on this. And there is a fuel valve. It's an aviation fuel valve that you change from the left tank to the right tank, right there. Wow. So it's a mechanical device. And on the dash is a rocker switch that changes the fuel tank from left to right, but it doesn't have anything to do with the fuel flow. It has to do with the fuel level. Yeah. So you change the sending units is all you do on it. So you change, so if you flip the switch, the mechanical device to the right tank, then you put the rocker on right and you're reading the fuel level in the right tank.
How about we go around and open the back?
Well, let's have a look in here.
Sure.
It's just high performance 302 Holley 715 carburetor, ZF gearbox, Borgenbeck twin plate racing clutch, because it's just a GT40 after all. But unlike the Mark 1s and Mark 2s that had a bundle of snakes coming out the back, this has a luggage box on it. So this has got 2 mufflers on it, and the headers look completely different. This is insulation to keep the fiberglass from melting or catching on fire. And the storage box in here, where you're supposed to be able to carry your luggage, would get so hot that I'm not sure that you'd want to put your sweater in there. We went to great lengths not to overdo the car. So if you look at it, it doesn't look like a brand new Pebble Beach restoration, but we sent the gearbox back to ZF to have them to make sure it was okay. The car's set for 30 years after all. And the guys at ZF said, we will make it look new. I said, that's not what we're doing. Just go through it, see if it needs anything. It needed gaskets and seals. We did the same with Coney. We sent the shocks back to Coney, and they were going to paint them and put decals on them just like they look like new Coneys. And I told them, I said, we're not doing it. I was very involved with the work on this. So all they did was revalve the shocks, and we put them back on.
you're really taking care of a piece of history that long after you're gone, the car will still be here. It's just an amazing feeling, isn't it?
It is, but I just like things the way they were, and after all, they're only original once. And once you restore them and you change the leather and you change the carpets and you redo the outside of the transmission, you paint the shocks, it's not the same anymore. So I like them just the way they were. Even though it's not a nice shiny car, there's just something to me about having an original car the way it was when it left the factory in Slough.
Let's do a couple of hot laps and jump in this thing. What do you think?
Hot laps is right.
Come on, let's go. Ah, ooh, this is comfortable.
This is how small they are.
Wow, it's surprisingly very agile, even though it's very small.
It's just a very light car, and I've told people before, it drives like a go-kart on steroids.
Yes. Yeah, he's giving you a little space. Wow, she feels great. Nothing beats that sound, right? Nothing.
If you want more Ford GTs to eyeball, stay put. When we come back, we'll show you the almighty Ford GT Mark IV and meet its owner on Ford GT, an American icon. Ford GT, an American icon, is presented by Exotic Classics, classic perfection in world-class motor cars, Princess Gates Entertainment, and by Lucas Ford, Eastern Long Island's premier Ford dealership. In 1967, Ford followed up its 1-2-3 finish at the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1966 with a record-breaking victory in the French Classic, won by Shelby team drivers Dan Gurney and A.J. Foyt. Carroll Shelby had upped the horsepower ante with the Ford GT Mark IVs by convincing his bosses in Dearborn to go all out with aluminum alloy versions of Ford's 427 cubic inch NASCAR motors and torture test them on engine dynamometers for hours on end to guarantee they would survive the 24-hour grind at Le Mans. And did they ever? Joey is with Jim Quickenhouse, who owns an original Ford GT Mark IV.
Hello, Jim.
Good to see you.
Good to see you once again in this gorgeous 1967 Ford Mark IV. Tell us all about it, Jim.
This is a Ford Mark IV. It's the only car made in America that won Le Mans. Its sister, J5, won Le Mans. This car finished fourth in '67, driven by Mark Donohue and Bruce McLaren. What happened was, this was part of the great Ford-Ferrari wars. Lee Iacocca convinced Henry that if he won on Sunday, he'd sell cars on Monday, and he said, okay, you know, let's design a program and go racing. It really started with Henry's second wife, as many things do. Henry had never been to Europe, and on his honeymoon he went to Europe, and she said, well, why don't you race at Le Mans? He had never heard of Le Mans. And then she made the great remark. She said, well, you know, Fords could never beat Ferraris. So Henry then went to, through Iacocca to Ferrari and tried to buy the whole company. And actually a deal was struck for about $18 million to have Ford buy Ferrari, and Enzo was fine with it. The road cars were going to be called Ford Ferrari, and the race cars were going to be called Ferrari Fords. And the deal fell apart because Enzo wanted complete control of all racing that Ford did, including Indianapolis, and frankly, Carroll Shelby, who had become a big pain in the ass to Ferrari when Shelby beat them in the World Championship with the Cobras. And Ford said, forget about that, and we're going to go our own way. Right. So Lee Iacocca and the rest of the Ford execs went off to England and they bought Lola. And that eventually became the Ford GT. And they actually finished first, second, and third at Le Mans in 1966. Enzo, in his being Enzo, said, that's, you didn't win Le Mans, you bought an English chassis and you stuffed a Ford motor in it, and, Ford hasn't won Le Mans. So Henry then spent, in 1966 and 7, to develop the Mark IV, $72 million, which is like the equivalent of almost $1 billion today in inflation-adjusted dollars. And he developed this car. This car is a honeycomb monocoque tub. It has its own unique gearbox designed by Ford, the 427 engine. And the chassis plate says, manufactured by the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan. So this was an all-American effort. There were two teams that went, the Shelby teams and the Holman and Moody teams. Shelby came up with a very clever thing that actually made the Mark IVs finish. The two Holman and Moody cars did not finish. And what he did was he realized that at the Mulsanne, where the cars were going 223, they had to stop for the Mulsanne corner, which was a 25-mile-an-hour corner. This heated up the brakes so much that Gurney told me that he basically did not really use the brakes except for that one stop. And so when they came around, though, the thermal shock of the cold ducted brake air hitting the calipers and the rotor would cause them to crack. And the two Holman and Moody cars actually had brake problems. One went into a sandbank and one had a very serious crash with Andretti, possibly due to the fact that they didn't seat the brake pads right. But what Shelby did was he blanked off the front of the brake ducts and he took the braking air from behind the radiator so it would be slightly warm, and he sent slightly warm air to the rotors, and that kept them from shattering, and those were the two cars that won.
We'll have more great history from Jim and Joey when we come back on Ford GT, an American icon. Let's join Joey and Jim Quickenhouse, who's about to give us a close-up inspection of his original Ford GT40 Mark IV.
I cannot believe the difference from a Mark I, Mark II with all the toggles and all this.
Oh, it's completely different. This is completely interchangeable. So this was one-piece military spec relays and things that can bolt in and out on a quick disconnect.
Now, were all the shifts on the right-hand side?
Yeah, the shifts are on the right-hand side because all race cars are right-hand drive because there are more right turns in a race course. So it's easier, you're faster in a right-hand drive because you see the apex. And Americans and most people grow up shifting the right hand, so they put the shift on the right.
Was it mandatory for the two seats?
Yes, Le Mans is basically, you had to make a road-going car. It had to have two seats, luggage box, headlights, taillights, windshield wipers. It had to be road registerable. And as a matter of fact, because it's a 67, when I went to motor vehicles to register it, it was a non-issue. They said, what's the VIN number? I said, J6. They said, J6, that's not a VIN number. I said, run it, see what happens. And Ford had registered it. It came up in the computers as a VIN. So this is registered as 1967 Ford J6.
Now, Jim, as you mentioned before, I noticed the eyeglass. Now, that was for the oil to see what the level was because you weren't able to touch the car for a certain amount of miles,
here's
correct?
The thing. You were not allowed to add water or oil to the engine for a certain number of miles. And you had these things which they ran wire with a lead seal on it to seal it. And when you came into the pits in the required time, they would cut it off and let you do it. This was not really a cheat to add. This was so that they didn't have to open the tail to see if they needed oil. Because if they came in the pits and they didn't need to add oil, they left it. They would know if they needed to add water because it would be overheating.
The other thing I did notice was the gurney bubble. Would you explain it a little bit on this car?
Yeah, this car did not, of course, race with the gurney bubble as it was raced by Donnie and McLaren. The gurney bubble was only on its sister car, J5, because Gurney needed it to fit his head in there. But after Le Mans, Ford took both cars and they painted this car as a clone of the winner. They put on the gurney bubble and they send them to car shows. So if you went to the LA car show, you might see the real winner, and if you went to the New York car show, you would see this car and it would claim it was the real winner. Well, Ford lost track as to which was the real winner, and the race record showed that J6 was the real winner, and they gave this car to A.J. Foyt, their driver of the year, as the Le Mans winner. When I bought the car, I very much doubted that it was the Le Mans winner, because I saw the one in the museum and I thought that probably was the winner. So we went to the museum and we worked with the museum, we took the cars apart, and we noticed that the one that they have, there's a pan that's been added to the floor and banged on to fit Gurney to give him some extra headroom. So there's no question that theirs is the winner and mine is the Donnie McLaren 4th place car. The other mystery was my car still had its chassis plate, J6, and J6 is listed as the winner by the French. It's wrong. And the car in the museum, someone stole the chassis plate, so they didn't really know. But when I found that, I repainted the car in the proper colors exactly as it raced at Le Mans. I left the bubble on because it's a part of the history installed by Ford.
Oh, yeah, sure. And the original shift knob was wood like that?
Yeah, the interior is exactly original. The interior fabric was Ford Fairlane. I mean, this is as original as a race car comes, the reason being that it raced one race. When a car has raced Sebring, Daytona, the Targa Florio, many other races, crashed, burned, flipped over the years, it gets changed. This guy raced one race, did not crash, was not molested, and is one of the most original race cars on the planet. This is the spare tire flap. So when they came in the pits, what they did is they pulled this, they grabbed this, they opened it, they took the spare out, they touched it to the ground, put it back, did this, closed it, and they were good to go.
Because in the Mark 1s and Mark 2s, you'd have to open up the front trunk.
You'd have to open up the trunk, which took time. I mean, this car represented everything they learned about racing. And it's really a remarkable piece of history and engineering, frankly.
Do you know what the taillights were off of this?
Yeah, they're off a Corvair. This was sort of a FU to Ralph Nader. So, who at the time wrote Unsafe at Any Speed. So that's what the Corvair taillights are from.
Jim, once again, man, it was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
An honor to be here. Just a beautiful, beautiful car.
We hope you've enjoyed this memorable journey through motorsports history and the legendary exploits of the Ford GT that have been kept alive by a new generation of Ford GT fans. For Maria Prekagis, GT Joey, and all of our special guests, this is Bill Stevens, hoping you'll join us again next time on Ford GT, an American icon.